My name is V, and I'm a criminal justice major.
And my name is Cade. I am also a criminal justice major with a concentration in CSI. And we are in the criminal justice course 4400 Sex Crimes. And this is a class that's really important, just kind of about sex crimes, statistics, common myths. And this is our final project, is to create a podcast, just kind of raising awareness, breaking the stigma kind of a thing.
The biggest thing that we want to get across with this podcast is, as Kate said, to just raise awareness. And the goal of the podcast at the beginning of the semester was to come up with a solution to sexual violence. And we realized that that's kind of a very broad question and it's very hard. So hopefully this podcast will put sexual violence into perspective. And we should probably start off with defining what sexual violence is to do that. So, what is sexual violence?
That is a great question. The truth is, sexual violence doesn't really have, in legal terms, a very clear definition. And a lot of the times when people think about sexual violence, they immediately go to rape. And rarely do they kind of think that actually stalking and harassment does actually count as sexual violence, actually. It's like unwanted sexual emails, forced kissing, stuff like that, wolf whistling.
Yes.
All that actually counts as sexual violence.
Yes, and the whole perpetuation of this rape culture really just helps add to all of those instances of sexual violence. And so
we kind of want to talk about some of the myths and misconceptions, because part of the journey to solving sexual violence is going to be breaking those myths and bringing the truth to light. There's a huge rape culture in society today that unfortunately we've kind of normalized. We've all seen the pyramid, where at the very bottom of the pyramid are the rape jokes, are the locker room banter, and these kinds of things that seem harmless at first, but unfortunately they allow for much harsher behaviors to take place. And so that eventually the very top of the pyramid, that's where you find drugging, molestation, rape, and stuff like that. So unfortunately it's all part of the same culture. It all feeds that same beast.
So now we're going to go over some of the myths that come with the topic of sexual violence, because there are a lot, and that's a big problem. That's why sexual violence is so prevalent, because it seems like we don't know enough about it, right? It's such a taboo topic. Nobody talks about it. So to start off, there's this misconception, and I know I've had it before, and I know people that have this misconception before, that they themselves are not going to experience sexual violence at all during their lifetime, and that their acquaintances or their loved ones, they couldn't experience that type of violence either. Just because it's such a taboo topic, I feel like it's easy to hear all the scary stories and everything and kind of just separate yourself from that and say, oh, well, that's tough that happened to you, but that wouldn't happen to me. I wouldn't do all of these things, right? And unfortunately, that's not the case. More than 1 in 3 women experience a form of sexual assault or sexual violence in their lifetime. And that's a pretty high number. I'm sure every single one of us has at least met one person that's been affected by it or has been affected by it. So we really, really need to break that stigma.
And that's another really sad thing, is the possibility that you yourself could also be a victim and just not quite realize it yet. Another very common myth is that men can't be a victim of sexual violence, when in reality, according to the CDC, the statistic is about 1 in 4 men will actually be a victim of sexual violence in their lives. And so that's something that we really need to shed some light on, because a lot of men are afraid to come forward about their sexual violence because they fear retaliation, they fear not being seen as manly enough. It's just toxic masculinity and stuff like that.
Yes. And we have to keep into account that these statistics, 1 in 3 and 1 in 4 from the CDC, that's just what we know of. There's so much that goes unreported. that doesn't even see the light. So there's like a big possibility that this number is way higher than that. And this is just what we have and what we were able to gather. So another really important myth that I think we need to debunk is the myth of false reporting. There's this big misconception out there that usually it happens like during a trial, that the victim falsely reported their rape, right? And this misconception is really dangerous, and I don't know where it came from, but the reality is that less than 2% of rape cases have been reported false. Less than 2%. There's more probability of somebody faking their own death than there is of somebody faking their own rape. It's ridiculous. And so I think it's really important that we shed light on that, because that's something that I've heard all my life. And that's the first thing that people think of when there are allegations of sexual assault. They automatically say, well, this person, they were a good person, so this person might be lying, and that's just very, very not likely.
Definitely.
Yes.
And I feel like in a lot of, especially criminal cases, we live in a world where you're innocent until proven guilty.
Yes.
But in the terms of sexual violence and sexual assault, it really needs to be kind of flipped almost. We need to believe the victim first,
Yes.
and then try and find other ways to see if there are holes in the story. But the first thing we definitely need to do is believe the victim first.
Yes. And that kind of sounds a little bit sketchy because of the way that our legal system is built. But I mean, we can agree that reporting a sexual assault is brutal to whoever makes that report. That survivor has to go through so much, and their whole character is torn apart. Their life is torn apart because the defense is always going to go into these trials looking to kind of destroy the victim's character. And so that's the biggest thing that we have to realize. Like, this is why we should treat these cases a little bit differently.
Definitely. And another really important thing to touch on, especially in college age, is alcohol and drug use. A lot of people consider that if an assault happens or if violence happens when one or more people are under the influence of alcohol or drugs, then you can't call it sexual violence. You can't call it sexual assault. When the truth is that is not the case. Whether there is alcohol or not involved, it is still a crime. You'd still victimize someone. Someone is still being hurt. And so that's something else that we really need to break the stigma of. Is just because one or more parties are under the influence of something does not mean that they relinquish their responsibility.
Yes, if anything, it makes it like you should be more careful if alcohol or drugs are involved. You really should stay away from any sexual contact, in my opinion, But with that, it's also important to know that there's this stigma out there that sexual assaults happen in alleys, and that those assaults happen when you're just walking down the street and a stranger just grabs you, attacks you, and takes advantage of you. That's not true at all. The reality is that 85% of sexual assaults are perpetrated by an acquaintance. So that idea that a stranger is going to snatch you on the street and rape you, that's very not likely.
Not to say that it doesn't happen, but definitely that's the minority of cases.
Yes.
We've been taught all our lives stranger danger, when that in and of itself is actually kind of a myth, actually.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's the people that we love, that are close to us, that really take the opportunity to hurt us in these ways. And sexual assault and rape, those are not crimes of opportunity. They're not crimes that just happen, It's more than that.
So we've actually covered a number of different cases within the semester, and including actually Katie Costner is one of the cases that we discussed in this semester. And Katie Costner was a college student, and in 1990 she went on a date with an acquaintance, and it was going pretty well, and then he wanted to go back to her dorm, and she said yes. And when they went back to her dorm, he kept wanting to make sexual advances, and she kept politely telling him, no, maybe it's time we just call it a night, stuff like that. And he just kept pushing and pushing, and finally he just took advantage of her and raped her. And she came forward in 1990 about this, and this kind of really started the main discussion about date rape, about acquaintances being the ones to perpetrate sexual violence. And it's stuff like that that's really, really important to talk about. Is just because they went on a date, just because they knew each other, doesn't make it any less serious.
Yes. And I feel like when you look at the way that our society works, women are supposed to go on a date with somebody, and then when they make a sexual advance on them, they're supposed to say, oh no, I don't want it, but I kind of do. You know, it's this like seductress type of image that is portrayed by us in the media, you know, and so I feel like this is like the core of why date rape is so prevalent, because we are told that that's how we're supposed to act, and that no doesn't actually mean no if it's coming from a woman, especially if she's drunk. You know, it means maybe, you know, if you keep trying, you might get something, which is super dangerous. So that's important to note.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Another really important case that we talked about during your class is the case of Chanel Miller. And I really recommend that everybody reads this book, because it's amazing, and it really puts the whole process of unfortunately being a victim of sexual assault and reporting and everything that comes with that. It brings that process into perspective. And it's called Know My Name, and it is by Chanel Miller, and she's an amazing writer. Great book. But after reading this book and kind of analyzing her case, that really put like the whole process into perspective for me. Like, I really didn't realize how much actually went into like reporting rape and everything like that. So Chanel Miller was a girl. How old was she? Do you remember?
22?
She was 22. Yeah, she was a 22-year-old girl, and she lived by Stanford University with her parents. And on a weekend, her sister came down from a different university, and they decided that they were going to go to a fraternity party that was being hosted by one of the fraternities at Stanford. So, you know, they got all pretty, they went out, they were having the time of their lives. And she mentions in the book that she generally doesn't drink that much. And she thought, you know what the heck, it'll be just a good time. I never go out, so I'll indulge a little bit with my sister and her friend, you know? Why not? So they had a few drinks, and unfortunately, Chanel is woken up by a dumpster after a night of drinking, and she discovers that she has been sexually assaulted. And so that's kind of what that book talks about, her whole process, kind of coming to terms with that.
Definitely. And you might know, unfortunately, you might know the case better by Brock Turner.
Yes.
That was the man that assaulted her. And she actually did black out that night, and she woke up in the hospital bed, and she didn't know what quite had happened. And so her case really brings up the importance of alcohol not being an excuse, and how just because she went to that fraternity party, she chose to drink, does not mean that she deserved to be assaulted the ways that she did. And so another case that we've actually talked about that's actually pretty ongoing, pretty recent, is the case against Lonnie Norton. And that is a man who was accused, convicted as well, for the assault of his estranged wife. Their case is that they were estranged. The wife had actually left Lonnie and had stayed at a shelter with her kids, and then moved in with her parents. And Lonnie actually still had partial custody of the kids. He was allowed for visitation as long as it was supervised, but he was to have no contact with his wife, Heidi. And so one night, when the kids were staying at his house, she messaged him just to ask if everything was going okay with the kids. He said, yes, everything's going okay. And then a few hours later, he breaks into her house, had kidnapped her at gunpoint, and took her to Fort Douglas. And they found an empty office space where he tried to convince her to come back with him and that they should still be together. And then he raped her a number of times, both in the office and in the bathroom. And so once that went to court, they really discussed the myths about marital rape, about very much he said, she said kind of consent. Why didn't she get help by the supervisor watching the kids? Topics like that were touched on. And so we're going to be talking about that case as well throughout this podcast.
Yes. And it's really important to bring up that fact of marital rape. Because one of Lonnie's statements was, I can't rape you, you're my wife. So it's really important. So throughout this podcast, we're going to be mentioning the case of Chanel Miller and of
Katie Costner
and of Lonnie Norton, just to kind of discuss all the myths.
So, and we are Weber State students, but this podcast is going to be not only for Weber State, not only for college students, but anyone else who wants to use it. Throughout this podcast, yes, we will be talking about the Chanel Miller case, the case including Heidi Norton, and then Katie Costner.
And it's important for you guys to know that if this story sounds familiar to you, meaning you or someone you know has experienced sexual violence, please reach out to Utah's 24/7 Sexual Violence Crisis Line at 1-888-421-1100. For help at Weber State, reach out to Safe at Weber Advocates by visiting Shepherd Union, room 322. Email safeatweber@weber.edu or call 801-626-6090. Information is also available at weber.edu/safeatweber. Thanks.